Hello and welcome to live stream number 2 of Dynamic Range Day 2023. And this is Seat of the Pants live streaming. I'm delighted to say that my good friend Liz Shaw from the Toybox Studio and Recording Studio Rockstars podcast has joined me. He only has 15-20 minutes before he has to go and do a full session in the studio. So I'm going to bring him straight in without any further ado. Liz, thanks so much for being here.
Dude, it's great to see you. It's a pleasure as always.
As well. Okay, so the idea of this stream, today is Dynamic Range Day, and it's all about people feeling confident to mix and master their music with the dynamics that is right, that is best for their music, and not feeling pressured into making things loud unnecessarily. And something that I hear a lot of people talking about or saying is that if you want to sound loud on streaming services, you should still make your original master super loud, even though it's going to be turned down, because the result of that is that you will still sound loud on the streaming service, even though the levels have been evened out. And that's not my experience. It's not how I work. But I thought rather than you guys taking my word for it, I would talk to Lidge, because about this time, I guess last year, I mastered his song Spring. Spring is a wonderful thing.
Spring is an amazing thing.
Amazing thing. And it's Dynamic Range Day, and it's still spring, although it's not quite as spring-like today as it was yesterday. So it seemed like a really good example. So, Lidge, why don't you kind of talk us through what you had already done with the song in terms of the mastering, and what, you asked me to take a shot at it. In fact, I was giving you some advice on it, and then you said, hey, look, you just do your thing. I'm curious to know whether you kind of had concerns about that, because I told you that I was probably going to make a more dynamic master, which so a lower loudness, and I thought that would be better on the streaming services. Did you feel confident about that, or were you kind of nervous?
Well, I mean, I wasn't necessarily nervous, but there was a little bit of a leap of faith, because I had done a mix myself, and I had done what we all typically do, which was take that mix, find a limiter, try and make it louder and louder and louder, because I was doing what I could to try and match what I was hearing coming off of other CDs or because I mean, I'm even throwing out CDs, because I think when I did the song, CDs were definitely pretty phased out, but it was still like, 2012 or something like that. So I had recorded the song a while ago, and I was just trying to make it sound as loud as other stuff that I was listening to. And, the irony of that is traditionally we're pushing our own mixes up into that limiter, squashing it, because we're just trying to get it to sound as big as the next guy. And with the shift in what's happened with streaming, and you've done such an amazing job of educating us all on this, is all of a sudden the playing field got leveled. And it was important to understand the new loudness. That's another way to think of it. And so, you encouraged me to back off. I had to, I even had to dig through the archives to find an original mix. I think I even had to re-edit together my original edits, because I couldn't even find the raw pre-mastered mix to send to you. And so once I did that, you were able to take my raw mix and master it with a real respect to the low end. That was the thing that really struck me most about what you did is, and I'm sure you might remember and want to talk about that, but you were very, very thoughtful about how to make sure that the low end was full. And that is in a lot of ways, that's a typical struggle with trying to, make it louder, is we lose that low end. We lose the transient punch of things, but we also lose the fullness of the low end a lot of times.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. And you're right. I remember now, you sent me a version of the mix, and I was like, I can work with this, but it'd be even better if you could get me an early one. And yeah, you had different verses and choruses. You had to recreate your original edit. And yeah, I mean, it's interesting, the comment about the bass, because you're absolutely right. This is something that I talked to Mike Senior about just this morning on the first Dynamic Range Day live stream, which anybody who's catching up on this, you can watch the replay. If you go to dynamicrangeday.com and click the live button, it will take you through to a page where you can find all of today's live streams. And yeah, we were talking about the fact that somebody asked the question, does reducing kind of low end in things like toms make things sound louder? And my reply was, it doesn't make it sound louder, but it allows you to push it louder. If you try and push something with lots of bass super loud, that's the first thing to start cracking up and distorting. So one thing that often very loud masters have in common is that they don't have a ton of low end.
Yeah.
Interesting thing is, that's not why I did it for this song. For me, it was just about the song. It was like the low note of the bass guitar. I just wanted it to sing out more in the key, to really make that chorus come alive musically. So
yeah, and I really
did that.
appreciated that. I thought that was cool how you were paying attention to the song. It wasn't just an automatic. It wasn't just a sonic thing. You were listening for the bass notes of the bass part and making sure that they all spoke.
Of course, yeah, and I think that's maybe something that it's difficult, right? Because people ask someone like me questions, and you want to give them useful guidelines. So you start talking about numbers and kind of technical stuff, rules of thumb. But that's not how I and most mastering engineers think when we're working. It's, here's a piece of music. What can I do to make this piece of music just the best it can be? To really,
and that's the way we think when we make music too. Like we might not even acknowledge it, but we're always thinking about the musicality of the parts when we're putting it together. Hopefully.
Yeah, absolutely right. Yeah, but it's about a song, isn't it? You want to get the song to the people listening to it. So, and it's interesting because so I would say generally I was able to improve the EQ. I was able to sweeten up the top end a little bit and that low end. And because I wasn't pushing it quite as loud as, your master wasn't super, super loud, but I think from memory, I backed it off a dB or two.
Yeah.
And that gave me some room to go on.
I'll just comment, because you were asking me whether I was nervous. That's the kind of stuff that makes you nervous as an artist, is when you're mastering an engineer, when you're encouraging me that you're going to back it down, and it's like, oh God, what's that going to do? But then when I hear the final result, it really struck me. So I have Spotify that will, play in the car. And when I hear my track come up, I've had enough time now where I can go and compare it to some other music that's out there. And it's loud and proud, man. It is not lacking in the least bit. In fact, it sounds better than a fair amount of successful records that I've listened to,
which is fantastic to hear, right? Because that's the opportunity that we've all got if you're paying attention to the dynamics. Because to go back to a technical thing, another musical thing I really wanted to do with your song is it's got this great hooky chorus. And when it got there, I just felt like it could lift a little bit more, just kind of really come out and grab your attention. And a nice way to do that at the mastering stage, you can do it in the mix stage as well on the stereo bus, but it's just to use a little bit of automation to just lift that gently going into the compression and the limiting. So, which is what I did, and it worked really nicely. And I think you commented on that as well.
I think it's great that you did that. To be honest, when I'm mixing, when I'm editing, I've learned so many different ways to just sort of hack something together to make the song and the production do what I want it to do. And I've always been, it's always been a big fat question mark for me. I'm like, do mastering engineers do that when they work on a mix? When they're mastering, it's like, do they take the volume of something and turn it up or turn it down in different sections? Because I would if that's what I was doing. So it was cool to hear that you did that. I'm not sure if everybody does it. Look, there's Brian Murphy just jumped in. Brian, do you do it?
I don't have my glasses, so I can't read the chat, but I'll let you tell us what.
Yeah, we'll probably have a delay on it anyway. But a shout out to some folks. We got people jumping in from Tokyo, from UK, all over the place.
Yeah. Welcome everybody. And while I think about it, thank you for reminding me, Lidge. If you're watching this and enjoying it, please share it so that other people can find it and hopefully get some benefit too. I think the answer is that not all engineers will do it. I think some engineers would say that was overstepping on my part. I don't feel that it is, because one thing is, remember, any mix typically is going through compression and limiting. So whatever dynamics you had in the original mix are going to be controlled to some extent. And if the end result of that isn't right musically, I feel it's part of my job to make it as right as I can musically. And if that, I only lifted it like a dB, right? It's just enough to push it out. And the kind of the reason I mention it is, again, that was a benefit of having taken the overall level back slightly, was I was able to do that. If I had been pushing the mix as hard as you had initially from the get-go, then that increase in automation would just have worked against the limiter even harder and wouldn't have had the same impact. So I'd either had to push it more, which would be even more limiting, or maybe, just settled for a result that wasn't as effective. So, that kind of two-stage process of okay, let's just step back a bit. We're safe because it's going to get normalized. Most people these days are listening on normalized platforms online. So we have that kind of safety net, if you like, and we can get creative and do the musical thing. And, happily it worked out really well. What did Brian say?
So Brian, he jumped right in and said, yes, he does that too. And he says he does some automating, some loudness in mastering. And, yeah, he said he agrees that it's kind of a subtle thing. And then we got Raj Koth joining us from the Philippines, and Kev join us from Scotland. I love live streaming. It's so cool. I was so excited to come on this call that I exuberantly drank my water, and that's why I spilled water all over my stuff for this.
I wouldn't have noticed that if you hadn't mentioned it, but well, no, you're right. That's what I like doing the live streams is a great energy. And you guys watching, if you want to drop some comments in, as you can tell, Lidge and I can see those. I was going to follow up on something that you were saying there, and it's slipped my mind. Well, first of all, what's the link where people can hear the song for themselves?
I was speedy and dexterous, and I grabbed it off of YouTube just before we.
Finding that.
So do I send that in the comments or do it in the private chat?
Yeah, if you paste that in the chat where you're seeing other people's comments, then everybody will be able to see it. I'll also put it in the description.
I don't think I seem to have a comment box in the big chat, so I just sent it in the private chat. Maybe you can.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I'll transfer that. Here we go. The other thing I was going to say is, if you're interested to see exactly what I did with Lidge's song, there is actually a full video where I kind of work through all of the mastering decisions step by step and play you examples and play you the before and after, so that you can decide for yourselves whether you think what we're talking about worked and was a success. So I will I'll also share the link to that in the description of the video, and I'll post it up on the Dynamic Range Day page as well, so that you guys can listen. So there's a ton more I can say about the idea of the automation and just this issue of pushing stuff super loud to try and make it loud on streaming. But I know you're going to have to dodge off soon, Lidge.
Yeah, I've still got a few minutes or whatever. Apologies, everybody. I've got a full band tracking session coming in at the top of the hour.
That's a good thing. Let's face it.
Hey, it'll need mastering too.
Well, there you go. Raj Kath is asking, how do you add dynamics to a pretty compressed mix, upward compression or parallel process? That's tough. I mean, one thing is, it depends what kind of dynamics you mean. In my mind, there are two types. There's microdynamics, which is the transients, the amount of limiting, clipping, all that kind of stuff. And then there's macrodynamics, which is the bigger stuff like verse, chorus. So even though I wasn't able to, what I did in this case was get Lidge to send me an earlier version of the mix, which had more dynamics than the one he sent me initially.
I think that's the answer. You just get him to send you the raw mix.
Yeah, that's the best example. And if anybody's kind of nervous about doing that with a client, I would say what I tend to do is I will do the best that I can with what they've sent, and I'll send it and say, here you go, this is my take on it. I'm pretty pleased with this. I do wonder whether I could get an even better result if I was able to get access to a less compressed mix, and I would love to do that experiment. Is that something you'd be interested in? Which I've had great success with that. It's a really kind of respectful way of offering somebody that chance. And then if they're like, no, this is it, we want to go with that, then it's all good. But every time they supply me with a less compressed mix, I'm able to get a result that everybody is even happier with. So it's a kind of super successful strategy. People talk about there are some plugins and there are expanders and this kind of thing. I think the best thing really is, I think if the microdynamics, if the peak if it's been limited, if it's been clipped, there's probably not much you can do about it. Maybe some EQ, just to put back some punch in the lows and the highs. That can
you put
work.
EQ into the low end on mine. You EQ'd the bass to bring out certain notes.
Yeah, well, I mean one of the interesting things is that if you've got something where the bass is low, then you can do that, right? Because the EQ basically just lifts the level of the bass. And because it was lower to start with, it's probably not squashed, so you can get some dynamics back. The challenge is when somebody's pushed the bass really hard and then the mix is crushed, and you're actually if you take the bass down, then you're kind of left with the side effects of the compression and limiting. That doesn't always work as well.
Right.
But I would say, I think I do encourage everyone to experiment with automation. It is always better to go back. Well, I don't know if it's better to go back to the mix, because in this case, the mix balance was great. It just needed a little extra push for the chorus to really make it sing out. So I think that's enhancing the macro dynamics, right? The verse chorus dynamics, the internal dynamics of the song. So
that's kind of an important thing. Verse into chorus is somewhat important, right?
Super important, right?
Now,
and
I have a question for you, Ian. When I interviewed Tom Lord-Alge, one of the things he talked about doing was widening and dropping that in on the guitars in a chorus to make them a little bigger. Mm-hmm. Do you ever use a widener to drop in on a chorus? I know that would have widened the whole mix potentially, but I guess what's in the center is still in the center.
I do sometimes use widening. Usually I use it on the whole mix. But now you're saying, I'm sure there have been a couple of times I've just done it. For me, I like to be minimalist in the mastering. So it's the least that I can get away with to get the best result.
Yeah.
And when you start doing like different EQ on different sections of the size, like automation is one thing, EQ is kind of step further, widening is a step further. But if that's what it needs, and if it works musically, then absolutely I would do that. It's and it can work surprisingly well with a full mix, depending on what's there to begin with. You have to be careful with widening. It's easy to go too far, but it's.
I was just going to say thanks to Daniel and Super Agent they said nice things about the track. Thank you. We didn't preface it, but we did on our longer video. But this was a song that I actually wrote with my daughter when she was 7, and I used to just sort of bang chords out on the guitar, and then she'd sing along, and she came up with a chorus lyric, and I was like, oh my God, that's brilliant, So then I sort of finished out the song from that, and it's a very feel good, happy tune that. The very funny thing about it is we get to re-promote it twice a year. Once for spring in the Northern Hemisphere, and once again for spring in the Southern Hemisphere. As long as it's English speaking, right?
It's a very canny marketing move.
Yeah, so that's working pretty good.
Fantastic. Well, listen, Lidge, I know you need to get off. I will, unless there's anything else you want to add. I'm sure everybody here knows about the Recording Studio Rockstars podcast. If you don't, just search for it. You'll find it. Amazing list of, how many shows have you done now, Lidge?
Boy, it's 425 or something like that. Wow. That's how many interviews I've done. I'm always sort of ahead of the curve on the shows that have been published, but lots and lots, 8 years of doing the podcast now. So if you're interested in hearing long form podcast interviews with mastering, mixing, recording engineers, and even studio musicians, I've even had studio managers on there. So it's everything focused on the recording studio. And I try to, my standard for the show, one of the standards is to mix it in such a way that you can turn the volume down and you'll never miss a word. So you can hear it nice and clearly. I have one closing question for you, though, Ian, about the low end in mastering. I'm a big fan of EDM music, which has a lot of bass content. Is it, do you have to have a different respect for the loudness, or just for how loud it is when you've got a lot of bass content? In other words, if you want a lot of bass content in a mix, do you have to turn the mix down slightly for the mids and the highs because you need more room for the bass, or is that a wrong way to think about it?
This is something that, again, that Mike and I mentioned earlier on today. I think the thing for me is that because I don't push the loudness super high, I can basically do what I like. If you give yourself more space to work with, you've got more flexibility. You've got more. It's safer to do whatever feels right creatively. So I certainly think lots of styles of EDM have, especially lots of sub bass, right?
Yeah.
So you certainly don't want to take that away, because you're changing the quality of the music. And then it's, mastering for me is all a question of balance. So it's, the risk is if you have something that where the bass content is much, much higher, when you put it on, I don't know, somebody listens to it on a pair of Beats or in a car with a massive bass bin in the back, it will just sound wrong.
Right.
So with mastering, it's all about translation. So it's like, you're not trying to get that kind of super level of bass on earbuds. It's more about getting it so that it sounds right in comparison to everything else on the earbuds. Yeah. So I guess the only difference for me is that maybe I'm kind of more open to there being ridiculous bass in, you don't want ridiculous bass in acoustic rock or maybe even, heavy rock. It's like, right. It needs to be tight and controlled in that sense. Some EDM where you have the kind of, wub bass and all that kind of stuff, it's okay for it to become oppressive and to take things over at certain times. So it's more of a creative choice. It's when you try and push past that then the bass might start to cause you problems, because it causes pumping or it causes distortion and all the rest of it. Was that what you were asking?
Yeah, I think so. I think a takeaway is just always make the bass what feels right to you when you're making the music. Just put it where you think it needs to be. And
yeah, absolutely. I mean, bass is challenging because we all, every room out there is going to have uneven bass response to some extent. So to be confident to put a ton of bass in takes, you need more confidence in your monitoring. You need to know that it's going to translate. So it's definitely maybe one of those things. It's one of the tougher things to get right. But at the end of the day, it is all about what feels musically appropriate. So yeah. And I mean, one very quick trick is if you use multiband compression, you could have one band for the low end and then another band for the rest. So then you can have more compression happening for the low frequencies and perhaps less happening up high. And that means maybe you can, I think one thing that happens with bass often is that if you have a slightly uneven bass response in the track and you use, say, a low shelf to push everything up, that bit that's sticking out sounds even worse suddenly.
Right.
Whereas if you push that up into a multiband compression, so that the compressor is holding that back, it just prevents that kind of lumpiness in the bass getting too scary. And that can really help get kind of that consistent low end content in there.
And this is for anybody watching, this is the kind of stuff Ian goes into depth with the home mastering masterclass and the other things that you have. So I love it. I have I wanted to just comment on two comments. One is a thank you to the Mix Club. If you're talking about listening to Recording Studio Rockstars on your drive, the drive is a great place for listening. And then also there was a Raj Kath had a question. Clients always pick the louder version of the mix for approval. How do you get around that if you know the not so loud version is better? And I have a possible solution for you. There's a tool that I use a lot now called Samply, and Ian knows them well as well. In fact, the reason why this answer is going to work is because of Ian. So Samply will let you create a playlist, and you can put the different versions in it as versions. So think about like flipping between different mix references, or different mixes of a same song. Samply level matches them in the same way that an online streaming service would level match them. So you can even decide, I want you to level match it just like Spotify does, or just like, I don't remember, you might have to say what the other options are out there, Ian, but that means that your client is going to hear it with the same level matching, so they won't hear one louder than the other. And I think you can select that on your end when you create the playlist. You can say, when they listen to this, make sure it's level matched. So that might be a great solution for that.
Yep. It's funny because Mike and I both, or I recommended Samply again earlier on today. They should be sponsoring today's event. I think they're getting excellent. A ton of free publicity. Yeah, I mean, in fact, they had loudness matching built in for some time now, but they reached out to us a while ago, and they now have loudness penalty integration. So the site that I set up with meter plugs that will allow you to find out how much the level of your music is going to get changed by the streaming services, that's built into Samply now. So yeah, you just go into the preferences and say enable loudness matching, and then choose this. YouTube, Spotify, Tidal, Apple Music, and Amazon, I believe, are all in there. They're all pretty similar, to be honest. It doesn't really matter. It's much more important that you match the loudness than worrying about which service it is. But yeah, that's a great way, of helping clients understand, because I mean, in an ideal world, I guess we would level match every mix we do, but it's at the end of the day, it's when you're worrying about all the other stuff that happens in mixing. It's nice to have that just kind of handled for you by the file sharing service.
Yeah, and I think people listening to stuff, I mean, as much as we want to credit ourselves for being advanced engineers, we also shoot from the hip a lot with decisions in music. And so, I think a lot of clients are just press and play on their phone and just hearing it out of a speaker on their iPhone to begin with before they're even in the studio listening on good speakers. So it's good to have those kind of levels automatically matched for you. I've put multiple mixes as on a project while I'm working while I'm working on the project, the mixes from rough mix all the way through final mix for a particular song are in Samply. And it's so cool to be able to click on them and they're all level matched and I can hear it, because sometimes, the rough mix was louder than the final mix where I left more room for it. But hearing the level matches and then hearing, oh, wow, I really am improving this, because sometimes we mix ourselves into a corner where we start losing our confidence and we're not sure if we're making it any better or it's just getting worse.
Absolutely.
Well, dude, thank you so much for having me on. Thanks everybody for watching.
Lidge, thanks for being here.
All right.
Pleasure to see you, and congrats on the song. Everybody should check out Spring. Is an amazing thing.
Please do. I dropped in a link for you also to Spotify if anybody wants to hear it over there.
Fantastic. Okay, everybody, hang around. I'm going to say a couple more things about this topic, but in the meantime, I shall knock Lidge out of the feed. But yeah, thanks again.
Ciao.
Okay, so, do I have chocolate on my face? That would be embarrassing. Oh, maybe it's just a mole. So, yeah, what we were talking about there, Lidge and I, hopefully that's kind of useful for you guys, and is because I do think, Lidge was asking my advice, and I was saying, oh, you should do this, you should do that, and he was kind of trying some stuff, and it wasn't quite working for him, and he wasn't quite confident about it, and then said, okay, go ahead, you try it. And I think he was genuinely, kind of cautious about that. It sounds great in theory, but when you actually are considering, okay, I'm going to put my song out at a lower level, it kind of, if you've always been aiming for that higher spot, it can feel nerve-wracking, but it really does work. And actually, even when you compare, I would say the original master of Spring, which is a bit louder, with my slightly lower level master, but a little bit more dynamic, I still think the more dynamic version stands up even without loudness matching, that's not always going to be the case, but I think in this time it worked. So you might be asking, why do people say, oh, if you just push it super loud, why would that ever work? Because if you make the master louder, but then it gets turned down more, how is that ever going to succeed? And one reason is that macro dynamic contrast that we were talking about, the contrast between the verse and the chorus. Because with any limiter, or with any compression, any dynamics processing, if you push it hard enough, there comes a point where initially the level goes up and up and up, then it starts getting more and more compressed, and then you kind of push and push and push, and it doesn't really go anywhere. It just gets more and more thick and dense without further increase in loudness, because you're so far beyond the threshold of the processor. And what that means is that if you're pushing up, here's the song, here's the verse, and here's the chorus, this one stops, and then the verse comes up in comparison. So you're reducing the macrodynamic contrast between those two sections of the song. That means when the song starts, this section is going to be louder than it was in the unmastered mix, because you've reduced that range of loudness between the two sections. And that might sound okay. You might say, well, okay, if that works, if it means that the start sounds louder and the song overall is louder, what's the problem? The problem is that this louder section of the song is constantly pushing up against the compression, the limiting, the clipping, whatever processing you have. And maybe that's a cool musical effect, but maybe it isn't. And maybe actually the better solution would be to automate this section of the song up, to improve that, to balance that contrast between the two sections, and then just lift this section up a little bit into the dynamics processing. So you can get, that way you get a win-win, because you get the higher overall level, the lower contrast between sections of the song, and the higher overall level of the song, but without having to push super compression and super processing onto that loud section. So that's another example of where I think automation is a better way of achieving the result that you want, the result that you need. Um, so, and so I disagree with the idea that, just pushing it super, super loud and then allowing the normalization to control it is necessarily the best thing. If that was a creative choice that you needed, that you wanted for the material, that's one thing. But as a general strategy for trying to achieve loud results online, because the other thing is this less compressed, louder section of the song, once it's normalized, will have more dynamics in it. It'll have more give and take. It'll have more of that punch and impact that it had originally. And that will have survived this process better, rather than push them both up and then get them turned down. If you just reduce the contrast, and because if you have to be careful with the transition, but where you change from the quieter section to the loud section to make sure that you keep the musical impact. But if you can achieve that, it's a completely transparent process, rather than this, which is pumping and attack and release settings and all that kind of stuff. It's just a clean level lift, and then you have a transition somewhere. So there's kind of no downside to it, really. Now, the final thing that I want to say about the point, and then I'll have a look and see if there's any questions or anything I need to follow up on, is that this all might sound a bit cynical. It's Mike and I in the first session were talking about whether people are trying to game the loudness normalization settings. They're trying to play the system to get an extra half dB here out of the loudness of their songs. I don't know whether that's the case. He thinks it is. I'm not quite so sure. But what I'm talking about here might sound like the same thing. But once again, we come back to, I'm explaining it to you in a technical way, but that's not the process that I go through when I'm mastering. When I was mastering Spring for Lidge, it was just a question of, okay, here's how loud the song needs to be. Okay, I think I need a little bit more bass there to really make the low notes in the chorus sing out. Okay, let's open out the top end a bit to give it a bit more space, give it a little more sparkle. I want the chorus to hit a little harder. And then when I measure it and I test it using loudness penalty or by the loudness matching on Sampley or whatever, you're just using a loudness meter and adjusting the levels by hand. It sounded great. Job's done. It's not like I said, I need to achieve this result, so I'm going to do this, this, and this. And the same thing applies. I do all of these things for musical reasons, and they end up working really well on the streaming services. I don't generally suggest that you try and do this simply to game the system. But for me, the reality is if the chorus is at this loudness, and then you put the song loudness matched on with something else and the introduction isn't loud enough, probably that's a musical change that you should make, not for loudness reasons, but just because that's the way that the song is going to work best musically. It's surprising when you listen to a lot of the best sounding tracks out there, probably the difference in loudness between the verse and the chorus is only a few dB. If you take an extreme example where I think actually maybe there's too much contrast, Zanny by Billie Eilish, it's a creative decision. I'm not saying they shouldn't have done it, but if it was me, I'd probably have encouraged them to reduce that verse chorus contrast a little bit, so that because it's something like 8 dBs difference. And for me personally, when I listen in the car, either I can't hear the verse or the chorus just blows my speakers up, or the drop, I guess you might say, rather than the chorus in that tune. So for me, musically, maybe there was a different decision to be made, and that's the kind of conversation you have to have with the clients. And I'm sure that conversation was had, and they chose what they were happy with. But even in a song like that, where the contrast is massive, my point is there's only 8 dBs of difference. I think that's right. So much more typical is maybe 4 dB or 3 dB, 5 dB, in that kind of range, or maybe less. So it's interesting, right? Because this is dynamic range day. I'm talking about dynamics, and here I'm saying actually maybe you don't want too big of a contrast. It's all about balance. It's all about finding the perfect solution, and that more dynamics is not always better. In fact, it can be as much of a problem. Too little in the way of dynamics is a problem. The goal is to find the perfect balance, the sweet spot. So hopefully that made sense and was helpful. Let me know if you've got any follow-up questions. Let's take a look at what's coming in here. Yeah, Brian says that EDM often uses clipping and sometimes distortion in the low end, but it's intentional. Absolutely right. And he also says he would have the client listen to both versions at the same volume level and then choose. Again, I completely agree. Kev says, if anyone's interested, listen to Titanium by David Guetta at a listenable level. The breakdown verses sound louder than the all-out chorus. That's something that occurred to me when I was talking to Lidge, and I didn't say it. Yes, when if you push things, if you start with a verse that was quieter and a chorus that was louder, and then you push it right up into that processing, sometimes this stuff can get held back so much that the verse actually ends up sounding louder, and it gets to the chorus and it takes a step down, which is kind of the opposite effect of what I think you want emotionally. Daniel's agreeing about Zanny. Super Agent B says, nostalgia. I guess that's about the David Guetta track. So that's great. I will just hang on a little bit longer in case anybody has any follow-up questions. But I think, hopefully that makes the point that I wanted to make in this video. And hopefully that's a useful bit of advice for you. And maybe if you're kind of thinking, this stuff about dynamics is good, but I'm still nervous about, releasing something at a lower level. These days, as far as I can make out, something like more than 80% of people are listening to music online. That's if you look at the sales figures, that's if you look at the usage figures. People are not using physical formats anymore. And almost everywhere online is normalized. There are some places that are not, but even in the places that aren't, people don't seem to care. So that's great news, because it just gives us the freedom to do what is best for the music. And that really is it's interesting because the first live stream turned out to be all about loudness matching, and this stream is turning out to be all about loudness matching. The final stream of the day, which is this evening at 10 p.m. UK time, and again, you can go to dynamicrangeday.com and click the live link to find a direct link to that, so you can find out what time it is wherever you are. I'm going to be looking at loudness on vinyl and how that might relate to what we're doing with digital mastering these days. So yeah, if you're interested, check that out. I'll also be announcing the winner of the Dynamic Range Day Award. You can see the nominees by going to dynamicrangeday.com and clicking on the award tab. Some fantastic sounding dynamic albums there for you guys to check out, including, she's an outsider, don't think she's going to win, but the latest Taylor Swift album is in there, somewhat controversially, but it's not ridiculously loud. And that's the kind of thing that I want to recognize. It's, as far as I'm aware, it's not affecting her sales. The fact that she wasn't mastered at -4 LUFS like Miley Cyrus, for example. So let's take a look. I saw a couple of questions come in here. Adrian says, do I think the overcompression and good frequency balance is related to a minimalistic music production approach? I don't. If anything, I think the opposite. Well, it depends what you mean by a minimalistic approach, right? Because what I'm seeing a lot is channel strips with 10 or 15 plugins on them, which is, as far as I'm concerned, is a maximalist approach. On the other hand, if you're talking about kind of recording with minimalist resort, not going into a full-blown studio and all the rest of it, I guess that could be a feature. If, again, in the first live stream, we talked about the fact that songs have a loudness potential, if you like. If your goal is to end up with something that is super high level, that's something you need to have in mind from the outset, from the writing, from the arrangement, through the recording, through the mixing, and then into the mastering. You can't do it all at the last stage. I'm not sure. I don't think that really that's what's causing the trend, though. I think it is just simply this. It's become a meme, if you like. It's become this idea that louder is better. Everything has to be loud. If you're not loud, then you're not going to be successful. That's what I hear from pro mixers and engineers that I talk to, especially with the major labels. If you go to them with something that is mastered quieter, you'll just get a flat no. It's just that they won't even listen to it, which is such a shame because, again, we talked about this with Mike earlier on today. I think 17% of people on Spotify change the normalization settings. So 83% listen with the default settings where everything, all the loud stuff is turned down and it's all at -14. But if you ask in a music production Facebook group, maybe 75%, 3/4 of people will say that they disable it. So most people who care about the music most are listening to the music in a way that people who buy the music or stream the music, listen to the music, aren't. So we're doing all this stuff trying to achieve this loudness, and it's just not necessary. And I think the same thing applies at the record companies. They have this idea, that things need to be a certain way, and they're enforcing that. They're asking everybody to comply with that. And I think if they didn't, it wouldn't matter. A ton of the examples on the Dynamic Range Day Award page will help prove that to you. There's music from every possible genre in there, all mastered with great dynamics by modern standards, all successful. It's safe. This stuff works. It's okay to do what is right for the music. And Brian says, one of the best streaming masters I've heard lately is Crazy by Icehouse. I can't believe how good this old 80s song sounds on Quobuzz. In my opinion, it's one of the best for dynamics. I don't know that one. I'm going to have to take a listen. And Martin says, great nominees. They are. It's a great list. And that's why I want to get this message out. That's why I care about it. That's why I'm still doing it 12 years later. I genuinely think that if we start to pay more attention to this, as Mike said this morning, I think there's reason to be optimistic that the levels will start to come down, and it makes life easier for us. It makes life more creative for us, and hopefully it makes the music more enjoyable to listen to as well. So thank you very much for your questions. Thank you for being here for the live stream. Thanks again to Lidge. As I say, I'll put the links. Please go out and check out his song Spring on YouTube or on Spotify, and I will put the link to that longer form video where I walk through that entire mastering process with you and play musical examples if you're interested to hear that as well. Please head over to the Facebook page, like the page. I'm sharing some ridiculous, this year that I'm doing Star Wars memes. We're having a lot of fun with that. Feel free to reshare those, get involved as well. And please do come back for the final live stream of today, which is at 10 p.m. UK time tonight. That's 11 p.m. in Europe and either 5 or 8 hours behind if you're in the US, depending. So that would be either 5 p.m. in New York or 2 p.m. in LA, I think. Don't take my word for it. Head over to dynamicrangeday.com, click the live button, and you can find the exact timer, countdown timer in your area. And please share this video if you found it interesting, you think other people will find it interesting, so we can help get the word out on this issue. So that's it from me for now. I will see you later and see you online. As always, thanks for listening.